everybody. I am Patty Dorito. I am the owner and founder of Holistic Healing Atlanta, where we incorporate the body, the mind, the soul for an integrative healing of the person. Tonight's topic is, what does trauma have to do with addictions? And I have a very special guest, but I picked this because there's a lot of addictions in the world and there's a lot of trauma. And a lot of times people don't even realize they've been traumatized. So I thought it'd be a great topic. I have a great friend of mine who is the owner of Transfiguration Counseling. I actually met Dr. Crete a while ago. He was my son's 4th grade teacher, and then we sort of parted a little bit, and then all of a sudden we met again because we were in the same master's program. So, and then we worked together at Holy Family Counseling Center for a number of years. Since then, we've both branched out to our own practices, and it is my great joy to introduce to you Dr. Gerry Crete. Dr. Gerry Ken Crete is a marriage and family therapist specializing in the treatment of trauma and addictions. He is the founder of Transfiguration Counseling and Consulting, which he integrates the Catholic faith with mental health counseling in Atlanta, Georgia. He is also the co-founder of Souls and Hearts, which is an online platform providing mental health education to Catholics through courses, podcasts, and blogs. You can listen to Dr. Crete weekly on Be With the Word, where he analyzes the Sunday readings from a psychological perspective. Dr. Crete earned his doctorate from the University of Georgia. He is also married, been married for 28 years, and has 3 grown children. So welcome, Dr. Crete.
Hey, nice to see you, Patty.
Yeah, it's great to see you. Also, if anybody has any questions, if you go into the comment box, you can write questions or comments, and we will read them. Okay, so I'm going to start with Dr. Crete. So why did you get into addictions and trauma? What made you go there?
That's a big question. It's kind of a long journey, really. Honestly, as a person who, is a trauma survivor myself, and who went into more education initially. I actually taught your son in 6th grade, by the way. You said 4th. Just putting it. I've never taught 4th grade. I thought 6th grade was a stretch because before that I'd been a high school teacher in Canada, in Ontario, Canada. But honestly, what happened was I actually then became a school counselor, and I worked in schools. I really enjoyed that. It sort of stretched me. But then when I started my doctorate, I had this idea that I was going to do work or research on how school counselors could be leaders, and in the school and in the community, and really wanting to explore how they could be more used better than the way they are in most schools. So this is what I thought I was going to do. But what happened is I ended up getting into being drawn in. Actually, it was you, Patty, who actually drew me into this one practice years ago to, basically try something out, a little different. And I got into marriage and family therapy. And that changed everything. I really started working with couples, working with families, and everything, and really loved that work. And I started to really see the difference one could make with the whole family and with couples, and it wasn't just about the individual. And anyway, so eventually my research shifted completely out of school stuff, and I actually, in the program I was at University of Georgia, they really did a good job of getting you to look inward and really look at your own life and looking at what moves you and what matters to you. And because I survived some trauma as a child, who hasn't really, right? But it really got me to explore the issue of trauma. I was really interested in how men respond to trauma. In particular, I feel like that was an understudied area, especially sexual trauma. And then how healing happens within relationships. So that ended up being my research dissertation was on basically male survivors of childhood trauma and healing in relationships, which is really different from school counseling. But that led me into just learning about addictions and how different people basically respond to their trauma or try to soothe it or try to deal with it through behaviors that eventually become addictions. So that's kind of what led to where I'm at now.
So the first thing I wanted to do, Adriana might have had a little bit of trouble here, but is to actually say, well, what is an addiction? You know, what constitutes a trauma? Let's start with that one. You know, like how does someone know that they have a trauma? Because I find actually a lot of people, when you ask them, well, have you had any traumas in your life? And they're like, let's see, no. But as we go through the process, all of a sudden, that's not the right one. There we go. That they start realizing, yes, they are trauma survivors, and they never even knew that.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I think a lot of people don't realize that. I think this is a good definition for trauma. It's an excellent definition. I would just add that there are traumas that people experience that are like what we call capital T trauma. Mm-hmm. So the biggest two types of trauma that cause like post-traumatic stress disorder would be the types of trauma, the violent acts, typically you see in, for example, in a military type trauma, like in a war area. So that, you know, those kind of traumas are capital T. The other main type is a sexual assault, so a rape, for example. So sexual assault and war type trauma or extreme violent situations are the biggies. But so people who haven't experienced either one of those kind of go, well, you know, I don't really have trauma. But that's not the case. Like we all experience small t trauma. I haven't met a human being that hasn't experienced some trauma, because it's the world that we live in. And so it can be anything from having experienced bullying in high school or elementary school, or high school, or any adverse event that was distressing and that maybe on some level threatened who you are as a person, right? It doesn't have to be a physical threat. It could be an emotional threat. It could be a spiritual threat. It could be, it could be verbal. It does, and so on. And especially when it's with somebody that is supposed to be in the role of taking care of you, obviously a parent, but it could be a teacher, a coach, or even a close friend. So those types of experiences that are adverse threaten one's sense of self.
Yeah. I did a talk a couple of weeks ago on the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Events Experiences. And so they also define trauma, which people don't think is parents divorcing or not being seen and cherished, neglect, not having enough food. I mean, people just survive these things and just go on. You could go back and watch my program on the adverse child events, or you can go to the CDC, put ACEE. And so in 1995 to 1997, Kaiser Permanente and the CDC did this study looking at children from 0 to 18. And then that went on to say more risky behavior, more alcoholism, drug abuse, chronic illnesses because of that. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent study. I love it because it's a very quick assessment that you can do with somebody that determines the level of distress or trauma or adverse experiences a person has had. And they actually correlate that number with health effects as well, right. Which I be of interest to you, I think, in what you do especially, right?
Yes. Yeah.
It's no surprise that people with higher ACEs numbers also have higher levels of addiction, substance abuse, also have higher levels of things like chronic heart disease or other types of health issues.
Right. Yeah. So the next slide I want to show is like, what is an addiction? So I just pulled this off of the internet so that people could kind of see, well, what is an addiction?
Yeah. That's again, I looked at it just now. That's an excellent definition. I always sort of look at it a little differently than some do, or try to conceptualize it differently. Most people who have had an adverse life experience have a kind of a wound, let's say a wound. You know, if we want to do like early, what is the inner child stuff? We have an inner child who was wounded. Okay, maybe we have several, and maybe we have an inner adolescent who's wounded too, and all this. But that wound, usually causes the person to feel a number of negative emotions. Those emotions can be things like shame, hurt feelings, sad feelings. There's a lot of negative fear. These are all negative emotions. We don't want to experience negative emotions. like most people want to avoid those. And so if we have a part of ourselves that is experiencing a lot of shame, a lot of fear, a lot of sadness, we push it away and we hide that, right? But the reality is it won't just be closeted. It will show up again. It will at different times be triggered, and it will show up. And so when it shows up, we want to go to something that helps us feel good and makes the bad feelings go away. So an addiction is some kind of thing, behavior, activity, substance that makes those bad feelings go away. And it does it, and when they're very intense, especially with the trauma, then it'll do it at all costs. It doesn't care what the consequences are, the repercussions. It will be soothed. The problem is most of the time those behaviors are unhealthy and have other negative effects, which then only then afterward lead to further feelings of shame or bad feelings. So it becomes a cycle.
Right. So I have a slide here on different kinds of addictions. So, of course, there's substances. So it can be legal or illegal, and that also includes alcohol. And then we have some behavioral ones, because I don't know that a lot of people necessarily say, I have a problem here, especially things like the internet. Well, I used to do mission work in Honduras, and we asked people not to bring their phones, or we put it into the Franciscan Friar of the Renewal lockbox just to keep them safe. Well, people got irritable and grouchy, and they were like, why don't you get your phones? And I'll say if I didn't have my phone, I'd probably get a little bit irritable too.
Right.
So, I think we all have a sense of that. What are you seeing the most of, Gerry?
Well, what I see the most of, part of my practice is I'm working with men, and not exclusively, but it's a major focus. And I do a lot of couples work. So I do tend to see more sexual type addictions, more than any of the other ones on this list. I see a lot more pornography issues, And here's the thing. Most behaviors, even things on this list, can be benign or good. So there's nothing wrong with playing a video game, or there's nothing wrong maybe with some forms of gambling. I don't know, like playing, some casual poker or something like that. Sure. We all have to eat. Most of us a lot of us are in relationships that are sexual. The internet itself is not bad. Shopping itself is a requirement usually of life. And so it's not that the behavior, there might be a few cases that the behavior itself is simply either because of your own personal religious values is just considered wrong. Like for many people, pornography would be just considered, out of bounds, right? But nevertheless, even underneath the pornography, there is a deeper need that is trying to be met there. So it's about identifying what is the real need, or at least what is a good, healthy behavior, and what does it look like when that behavior then is abused in some way, right? So, casually drinking, like having some wine or something with dinner, and a little bit of casual in social situations and this kind of thing, can be just fine, possibly. Then there's the question of, am I abusing it? So now I'm using this behavior. So it could be drinking, or it could be, hey, maybe I'm like binge watching some TV show and I'm doing that a little more often than usual, or I am playing the video game more often. And so now maybe I'm abusing that. Like I'm using it in a way that isn't so healthy. It's not really for my good. It's going too far. And then, but if that behavior persists, it can then lead to an addiction, right? And so an addiction is where there are some things present, like where there might be a sense of withdrawal if you took away the behavior, or where that behavior or that activity or substance is causing the person to feel less and less soothed, less and less good about themselves for whatever reason, but needs more and more of it.
Right.
Tolerance, right? They have a higher tolerance for the behavior, but less satisfaction with the behavior. So and then of course, if that behavior starts to have a real negative effect in one's life, in one's job, in one's relationships, now we know we're certainly out of use. We're beyond just abusing something, and now we actually possibly have an addiction.
So Gerry, what do you say to a couple where, like, maybe the husband or wife says, I don't see that my behavior, my drinking is a problem, but the other one says, yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah, no, that happens a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, and so here's the trick, like, sometimes there are assessments, right? So there are assessments for sex addiction. Sexhelp.com, I think, is a website that has an assessment for that. Obviously, there are numerous substance use assessments for drug and alcohol. There might be fewer things for some of the other things on this list. But so what I would say, though, is if significant others in your life are complaining or bringing it to your attention, it deserves at least some attention and some assessment, right?
Agreed.
Yeah, and that needs so you need to listen, because they're the people that are closest to you, and you might feel defensive, and I understand that one might feel defensive or feel like you're being nitpicked at or criticized or whatever, but it needs to be looked at. So that's the first step. Because even in those assessments, a lot of times the question is, have other people confronted you with this problem? The other thing is, one needs to take a hard look at one's life. Like a lot of people don't really put it together. Like I've talked to people, who say let's say it's a wife complaining the husband drinks too much or so on, and they don't think they have. But if they've lost a job over it, or they've had several DUIs, or their family members that won't speak to them anymore, those are all are signs. But somebody who's in the throes of an addiction ignores those and denies those.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
it's not easy.
yeah, it's very complicated. So I want to go back. So what do you see that trauma does to the body? Like what actually happens? So somebody's been traumatized, they've been abused, they've been through war. What actually happens that gets, I have my opinion on some of that, but I was just wondering how you see that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it has a major effect on the body. I do EMDR therapy. I'm an EMDR therapist. It's a type of treatment for trauma that considers the somatic, in other words, the body effect of trauma. And there's other forms that also do that. And I personally prefer those forms. Because the number one thing is that when you're threatened in some way, and to a little kid, you could be yelled at in a way that feels threatening to your whole body and your whole system, right? So you don't have to have been in a war zone. But nevertheless, if you feel threatened, there are things that happen physiologically to you. There are messages being sent to the brain, to the amygdala, for example, that says, we are in survival mode. We are being threatened. And so now parts of the brain are turned off, right? Like not maybe 100% turned off, but like the prefrontal cortex that does a lot of analysis and reflection and, you know, verbal reasoning stuff, that part goes offline a little, right? Because it just isn't needed. And other parts of the brain flare up because it has to get ready to what, you know, is typically called a flight or fight mode. Because when there's a threat, our bodies are designed to go into fight or flight. It's just part of how we're designed. We need to. If we're being attacked by a bear, your body's going to respond, which means your heart rate goes up, which means your breathing changes. You're not taking deep breaths, and you're not in any kind of Zen state. You're in a state that says, I have to be ready to act, to fight, to move. You know, so there's a whole physiological, your whole sympathetic nervous system is put online, is online and active, and it's necessary. So what I would say is that why we have, in my opinion, why we have such a problem with depression and anxiety in this country is that people are going around in fight or flight mode all day long, in their jobs, in their cars, in their relationships. They're constantly in a state that is only meant to be in during a real threat, right? And so it takes a toll on the body to be constantly in hyperarousal. We're meant to only be in that state for bursts. Mm-hmm. Get away from the bear. Then when we get away from the bear or whatever's attacking us, the other tribe, I don't know, then we chill. Then we go, I'm done. I'm through that. Then the entire body changes, right? We can breathe deeper again. Our blood pressure, our blood rate, our heart rate, all that kind of stuff changes. And then we go, and we discharge it. And we're like, I'm done with that. But that's not happening to us in our daily lives. A lot of us are living in chronic states. Okay, so I say all that, but then there's another one, which is that freeze state some people hear about. So a freeze state is when a person experiences something so traumatic that they think they're basically going to die. Whether that's an actual real physical death or just so overwhelming that the system is just overwhelmed. So they go into a freeze state. And that state is the opposite of the fight or flight. In that case, you actually go into a really low arousal state. Everything goes low and shuts down. Your whole system is like frozen, right? And that could be like a dissociation, right? So you disconnect from the present reality. And that way, like if the bear is going to devour you, you won't feel so much pain because you're really not there anymore to feel it. So that if that happens to a person and they don't get and they're still alive, right? So let's say the bear, you really thought the bear was going to devour you, but at the very last second, whatever, the bear keeper tranquilizes the bear and you get out, but you still, there's a part of you still stuck in that freeze state, right? And so, and sometimes that freeze state gets activated by other things going on. That's similar to like, you see that in military trauma, you see that in the sexual assault, like a rape, where a person has been raped, they feel like that's an example of like, I feel like I've just possibly lost myself and I dissociate from the situation because I can't escape, right? And so then things trigger the person to then go back into a freeze state or to disassociate even when there is no physical threat anymore, right? And so that's a little different than the fight or flight response. So those are two different ways in which a person might be reliving or be activated by their trauma.
Right. So going back a little bit now to the trauma. So in my world, I see that trauma also has a genetic component to it, and particularly in the dopamine receptor gene. And so, and dopamine plays a role in how we feel and experience pleasure. And it's also that it's a neurotransmitter and it's manufactured in our gut. So this is where like the holistic part comes in. So if we look at like a dopamine deficiency, here we have depression, apathy, fatigue, just low energy. You know, that I see that a lot. And then I think like what causes that low dopamine? Well, it could be drug use, it could be poor nutrition. Again, I work holistically, and I always ask people, what are you eating? How are you sleeping? Are you exercising? How are you managing your stress? And it could be, the cause of low dopamine level is actually antidepressants, chronic uses of them. So then ways to naturally increase your dopamine without using kind of a substance or a behavior is to eat lots of protein, because protein are made up of, like your meats, are made up of the building blocks called amino acids. And then that helps us to manufacture it gets broken down and it gets manufactured into neurotransmitters. So then I would say, eat less saturated fats, but consume omega-3 fish oil, consume probiotics, exercise, sleep, and then being outside. And of course, prayer and meditation are really helpful as well. Okay, now what happens if somebody has too much dopamine or an imbalance of the dopamine in the brain, and then they become aggressive and they can have poor impulse control, the ADHD, and then things like addictions and gambling, binge eating. And then what causes too much dopamine? Well, it can be drugs such as like cocaine, which is a fast increase in the brain, and it satisfies the natural reward system in a big way. But the repeated drug use raises the threshold, kind of like what you alluded to earlier, Gerry, that means you need more of it to get that same high. Okay. The last part of this are the dopamine receptors. So in the holistic methylation that I do, I want to balance the genes synergistically. And here, this is just kind of interesting. So the DRD gene, so it's the dopamine receptor. If the first one if it's expressing, you can have addictive behaviors. Often that's a meth addiction. The DRD2, here we have the list. You can see it online here. Anxiety, schizophrenia, cocaine, opioids, gambling, craving high fats and sugar because you're trying to do something with your to get that pleasure. Then you have the DRD3, and that is often heroin. It's interesting because a lot of entrepreneurs have this one, so it's not all bad. And then you have the DRD4, and that's schizophrenia, bipolar, addictive, eating disorders. It's also that person who does those risky, novel behaviors. Like, hey, everybody, let's jump out of this airplane. That's going to be fun for everybody. And irresponsible behaviors as an adult, and then ADHD. So I don't know if you've ever seen that kind of stuff, Gerry, but that to me is very cool because when you can balance it, then you can, so like
Let me ask you this, because I don't really I don't know anything about dopamine receptors on this level. All I know is in the addiction, right? You get a strong hit where maybe there was something that one was deprived of, and then especially low levels of dopamine or whatnot, and then suddenly you have a high level experience of dopamine, and then the brain is then trained or tricked or whatever to then go, oh wow, that suddenly felt good.
Mm-hmm.
A lot more of that exact thing, and so and I think that's also that not just the dopamine hit, but then also the emotional response that goes with it. So I don't know where marijuana fits on this in terms of types of drugs, but you could say I just know if I was like a 17-year-old and I felt like I was a loner and nobody liked me and I didn't fit in, then somebody asked me, hey, join us, we're gonna hang out tonight, and then you hang out and everybody starts smoking pot and you do too. So all of a sudden, you've got the pot itself. I'm assuming, I have to look at pot, but I'm assuming you get a dopamine hit from pot and from pot smoking. But not just that, you also get the feeling, the sense that I suddenly now belong.
Absolutely.
That's paired with this dopamine hit. And man, that's a cocktail that the brain will not forget and wants to go back to. which can be the beginning of an addiction.
Right. Which also, if we say you got to stop the pot, which also means that you can't belong anymore, because that's that close connection that they put together. It's like bound together.
Yeah, but I don't know the different is D1, 2, and 3, so that and 4, and that's interesting to me. So different types of drugs are hitting different receptors still within that dopamine what I'm seeing here, which would create a different, possibly a different effect in a person.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct for that. Yeah. So my next question is, why do some people go through trauma, do you think, and end up with an addiction? And some people go through trauma and make their way, and they're more or less successful. They launch, that kind of thing. Like,
yeah. Well, here's the way I look at it. We're very adaptive as human beings. So a person is going to experience some trauma, and they're going to find a way to adapt, one way or another. One person, like the exact same trauma, can create different forms of adaptation in different people. So one person experiences a trauma, and they learn, I need to be independent. My way to get past this trauma is to be independent, is to like work hard, do it on my own, only rely on me. That can become one way to adapt. Another person that experiences the same trauma might learn, if I get loud and break things, I get distracted, and that's my way of coping and managing, right? Another person might learn, if I check out with video games and smoking pot, let's say, then that's what gets me through it, and I survive that way. So all these different people can find a way to adapt. So when I look at a behavior, I don't look at it and judge it like, oh, that's bad. I look at it and say, wow, that's how you learn to survive, right? And that's why even when it comes to the DSM, which is the manual that psychologists and so on use to diagnose people, and I get it, it can be useful, but I actually look at that as a list of survival techniques that people have used. And this is the cluster of survival techniques. I've got blue in my hand. that this person has used to survive, right? So even if it's something like, say it's a child with a conduct disorder, right? So being aggressive to other kids, that just sounds bad, right? But that, for whatever reason, that's how that person survived, right? And so even when it comes to addiction, they're all just ways to survive. Now, are they healthy? Do they have negative consequences that end up being, terrible, possibly later on? Quite possibly. And that becomes a new problem. And that's probably what gets them into counseling, right?
Right.
You have to go back and realize what caused that survival mechanism, what caused the person to turn to that behavior or that substance, was probably, almost certainly, in all my experience, was an unmet need, something underneath it, and that they learned to adapt in a negative way because they had to.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's find ways to adapt in new ways now, which is hard, especially when you're old, like us.
For yourself, Dr. Crete.
So we don't want to change, right? It's hard to change.
Yeah.
But the reality is, when we really get under it and find out what the real need is, the real need is good.
Yeah. So when somebody comes into your office and says, I need help, and they have trauma and they have addiction, where do you start?
Well, you're talking about, first, you have to start by having a relationship with this person. So coming in to see you, even if they know you're well qualified and you've got letters behind, after your name, they still don't know you. So you don't know them, more importantly. And so I start by just trying to understand that person. I want to know about their life story. I want to hear what's going on. I want to hear what brings them in. I want to understand what their goals are. I want to meet them where they're at. And then I start to learn about the ways in which they've adapted. And some people adapt in incredibly powerful and beautiful ways,
Mm-hmm.
despite terrible adversity. Like, even if they have an addiction or they have something else going on that's a problem, it's always remarkable what people actually do achieve in themselves personally, and the resilience that people have. So that has to be honored first. That has to be understood first before you can start to get into the stuff we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Can you treat trauma without treating addiction, or addiction without treating trauma? I know the answer to the second one, you're absolutely not, because that's what you've talked about. But can you treat one without the other? Or how do you do that?
I see the addiction as a symptom and the trauma as a cause.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you can just treat the symptom, but it will come back, or it will come back in a new way if you don't get to the cause.
Correct. Yeah.
If you just treat the cause, so the trauma, without even discussing or figuring out the addiction, you're going to be in trouble, because the addiction needs, we do need to understand the trauma behind it, and we need to understand all that, but we also have to appreciate the fact that now there's a habit or there's a behavior that's conditioned now that's kind of ingrained and has a life of its own. So some people will come into counseling and they will work on all the past stuff and feel very affirmed, and maybe even do some real good healing, do some good therapeutic work on the past. And that just feels really good. But then they'll be complaining that the addiction itself hasn't gone away, because it's something like for example, if it's pornography or some kind of sexual addiction, then that's their go-to when they feel bad. So you need some time to unlearn that, and it's just kind of a conditioned thing that needs to get unconditioned. So that's why, like, even programs like 12-step programs or other kind of accountability programs,
Mm-hmm.
a person to take a break from the behavior, which is really hard.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. How do you incorporate, or what you think about 12-step programs?
Yeah, they're great.
SA, Sex Anonymous,
I think they're all wonderful. I think they're great. I think particular groups could have problems because we're talking about human beings. So I've heard of AA groups that were like way too severe, or SA groups like that occasionally. So that's why you need to like shop around and find a good group that you feel comfortable with. But there's a couple things going on here. One, it's an accountability program. So it's a group. It's a program of some kind that holds you accountable to just work on stopping the behavior itself, so that you can, because we're all creatures of habit, and when we feel bad, we're going to go to the thing we always go to. That could be a chocolate bar, that could be a drink, that could be whatever, any video game, like whatever. And so to change that is going to take a lot of time. And the common wisdom is like 90 days, for example, it takes a lot to get through 90 days. But when you do, you're kind of past a certain hurdle, just in terms of biology and habit. So there's that. But then there's also the fact that most people come to these problems with tons of shame. And even though they know it can't possibly be true, they feel like they're the only person in the world that is just that bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it just can't be true, because we live in this addictive society full of all sorts of addictions. So, but when they go to a group with, no matter what it is, and there's other people, and some of them I'm sure are crazy, but a lot of them are just normal people with normal jobs, and they're just cool people, and they also have the same exact problem or very similar. Something also happens there. The shame kind of gets lifted, and it's just like, okay, I'm not alone. And that's powerful, because most addictions do end up isolating a person from other people. And so 12-step programs or other group programs like that bring people together, bring things out in the open, we get vulnerability through that. It's just powerful.
Yeah, yeah. I love when my clients are in 12-step programs, and I love a good sponsor to help that accountability. And they're getting to know themselves at a different level and with an acceptance because people all have been there before.
Yeah, yeah. That's the biggest thing. I think that all addictions, in a way, are intimacy disorders of one kind or another. And as a human, which is so interesting because as human beings, we long for connection. I don't care. Like, I'm a super introvert, but I still long for connection. I want to be close. I want to be.
Mhm.
But what an addiction does is it takes us away from other people in the end. But
Mhm.
that's actually what trauma does too, and especially trauma when it's perpetrated by somebody we care for, right? Is because when you're a little kid, usually start off, it's often the mother, right? And breastfeeding and stuff, and the maternal gaze, like you're just baby, and you're just totally connected to the mother, and also the father's around, and eventually you have this family, and you feel close and connected, and that is how we're supposed to feel. We feel safe. So
Mhm.
something that interrupts that, right? Something shaming, something horrific. So it could be something like a personal problem, like a parent with an addiction themselves, or a rage, or something, and violence, or some kind of sexual abuse, anything like that, or just or neglect, or anything, or even if it's something outside, like that nobody in the family caused it, like there was a loss, like a death in the family, or like both divorce, or even like a huge economic downturn and causes a
A
disruption.
pandemic.
An epidemic, yeah. 2020, the year 2020. So something hits, and suddenly that person takes, is like, as a person, feels disconnected from others. And that is a threat by itself, right? The fear of
Mhm.
death, the
Mhm.
fear of loss, the fear of, and so that causes a person to seek something out to replace it.
Yeah. So, Gerry, I was wondering, are men more vulnerable to addictions or are women? I know you see more men, but I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we're human beings, so I don't know that there's a difference. I think there might be a difference in the types of things men go to compared to women. But I don't think that men are more vulnerable. But I'd have to look at the research on that. And do
Yeah,
more research.
yeah.
I
So
think
that, yeah,
men like men tend to avoid and withdraw more than women in relation. You know that as an
yeah,
EFT
yeah.
person. So if you look at the types of addictions that are more inherently avoidant, so that, like, to isolate away with pornography, to isolate away, with some substance, a little more than women. Whereas something, I don't know, like something like, I don't know, shopping feels like an externalizing thing, or
Mhm.
people can be addicted to rage, to anger, to,
Mhm.
just,
Mhm.
that probably is more women, but I'm generalizing right now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, Gerry, there's two more questions that I would like to sort of ask, put it out there. So, if I'm a parent and I see my child, maybe it's marijuana, maybe it's gaming, maybe it's pornography.
Right.
What do you recommend to parents to kind of help guide their children? They're under 18, they're still in your home, but it's a problem.
Yeah. Well, those are all different kinds of problems. So I think you do kind of go at them a little differently. I think but overall, I would say one has to take a look at the whole family system, right? I know that's hard to do. It's not about blaming, because I know a lot of parents will immediately, the child has some problem, and they immediately go like, I'm a bad mother, I'm a bad father, or whatever. They go to a spiral of shame, and that's not that helpful. But I do think we all live in a world with a lot of challenges. Like, it's just not easy to be a parent. It's not easy to have a family, and it's not, and we don't know how to do it, and we probably have a history. Most of us have a history where we experienced what we experienced wasn't perfect. So we're not going to be perfect, but we need to look at the system, and we need to say, okay, what's going on here? When especially with adolescents, I think parents make the mistake that they think that when their kid is now in middle school, or certainly in high school, that now they're just kind of more on their own, and they don't need to be involved in the family the same way. I kind of think that's a mistake. I myself probably didn't completely appreciate that earlier on. And so, because kids can feel, I think adolescents need connection. They're definitely experimenting and they're working on their identity and they got a peer group and all that's so important at that age. But they don't need to lose connection with their parents and with their family. And so I think, like all the things you would say to a couple, right, that you need to have, like we need to be talking, we need to be sharing, we need to have empathy, we need vulnerability, we need to be open, we need to, all these things that you might say to a couple, you also want to say to the whole family, right? Like what kids, adolescents need understanding, they need empathy, they need communication, they need quality time. And I think those, but a kid's not going to say, is probably not going to tell you if they feel abandoned, if they feel disconnected, if they feel alone and lonely. They're not going to tell you that, but they might be experiencing that.
Right. I see a lot of teenagers or young adults. It's like, why did my mother not see how much pain I was in? Or my dad. Why didn't my parents swoop down and rescue me? Which is a lot of pressure. I'm a parent. You're a parent. Because teens do tend to push away some. They want to be accepted by their peer group, but it takes a strong family to be purposeful. To say, we're going to stay connected as a family, and we're going to do these fun things, as my daughter-in-law says, forced family time.
Right. And they might protest a bit, but that I think it's needed, whether it's forced or voluntary. But I think that the environment needs to be put there. And I think what happens with parents is lots of different things can happen, but sometimes they might just think, oh, well, they're independent and they kind of let them be. So that's possible, and not realizing they actually do need more. Or it could be that the parents themselves get very busy and they don't recognize because the kids seem independent. So there's that too. But if you've ever talked to a teenager, like as a former teacher and counselor, school counselor, teenagers really like that attention. They like it when an adult is paying attention to them and talking to them and is real with them. But it's not the role of police cop, right? It's not the role of the parents. Sometimes think I have to be the cop all the time, and no kid is going to open up to a cop. We just say. So there is a transition, and it's very hard for parents to let go a little bit. But at the same time, they can't let go completely. So
okay.
It's a fine line.
Hey, so I've gotten notice here that we're running out of time.
Okay.
So, Dr. Gerry, how can people get a hold of you if they want more questions, or they want to see you, they feel like they've connected with you, or even your other program with your podcasts and
Well, I do run a group. I do have a group here called Transfiguration Counseling and Consulting in North Atlanta. I do have a few people that work with that group. I have Carol Howard, she's an addiction counselor. She also works at a methadone clinic. Like, she knows addiction even better than me. And so if you're dealing with addiction, reach out to us. We have her and Matt also. So I've got a team of people. And Ruth is also a Catholic life coach. I think you know Ruth as well, Patty. So we have a team at Transfiguration Counseling. I'm currently not taking new clients, but I do work with this team. So if you're working with anybody at Transfiguration, you're kind of getting me there too. But I do have another project going on called Souls and Hearts, and it's a online mental health resource for, it's especially targeted for Catholics, but really any Christian or anybody who's interested. And we have a number of programs. I actually have a course called Be True, and it's for couples where pornography problem has been discovered. And it's to actually work with the couple to work through that addiction. A lot of times, it's not always the men, but a lot of times it's the men with that issue. So that's a great course. We have other courses at soulsandhearts.com. And I have a weekly podcast called Be With the Word. So there we talk about the Sunday readings from a psychological perspective.
So, Dr. Gerry, I appreciate your time and your insights into addictions and trauma. It's really an important thing. So again, if anybody has any questions, you can contact us through me, through my website or Dr. Gerry's website. Next week, I have a nice show. It's How Much is Too Much? Kids and Screens. And it's Tuesday, September 8th at 7 o'clock with Wendy Barabell. So tune in. And if you want to spread the news with what you've heard tonight, be sure to share the information. So that next week's flyer, it's on my webpage, Holistic Healing Atlanta. So thanks everyone, and thank you, Dr. Gerry, for your time.
Nice to see you, Pat. Take
Bye-bye.
care.